When people think of person versus nature conflicts, they often think of the extremes, natural disasters like tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes. And while these are absolutely person versus nature conflicts, they aren't the only ones, and they arguably aren't the most useful of the types. Sometimes a smaller or more subtle person versus nature conflict is more effective because it can lead to other things in your plot. Which is why today I want to talk about how to effectively incorporate person versus nature conflicts in writing. In order to understand what an effective person versus nature conflict is, you need to know what counts as nature and how to use those conflicts in a meaningful, impactful way, which is what we're going to talk about today. And if you hang on until the end of this video, I'll tell you how you can get a free guide to building strong settings, because setting is a huge player in person versus nature conflicts. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. Let's start with what is nature in person versus nature conflicts. There are some things that always count as nature, and there are some things that sometimes count as nature. So we're going to talk about both of those. The thing most people think about when they think of nature in person versus nature conflicts is the weather. This is definitely nature. Storms are a great conflict. Those natural disasters are great. But we can also use smaller pieces of weather in order to create person versus nature conflicts. Slippery ice, wind in your face, things like that also create conflict. Similarly, we can use other small things that are out of place in your character's opinion or that are dangerous in order to create that same nature conflict. Think about something like quicksand, or something as simple as plants growing in the wrong place, like weeds in a garden. That's a conflict with nature that your character has to deal with. And these conflicts become even more impactful when they force your character to face something that they are dealing with inside themselves. For example, that quicksand example, if it's the first time your character has to ask someone else for help, that's a big deal. That's a big bit of personal growth. Person versus nature can also include the 4 elements. Similar to weather, these are great ways to add conflict to your writing. Water can be deadly both in large amounts like an ocean and in small amounts. It only takes I think it's a tablespoon or a teaspoon of water to drown. It can also be a more subtle, smaller conflict like a dripping faucet that's driving your character crazy. Fire is equally destructive and dangerous. So can air be. We have all different types of poisonous gases that your characters could be exposed to, and the wind itself can be a conflict. Earth, again, the plants growing in the wrong place, boulders can crush people, quicksand, lots of different ways that we can use the 4 elements as conflict in our writing. Now, weather is something that almost always counts as person versus nature. Another one is animals, as long as they are beasts and not characters in their own right. So an example of this is the cat Crookshanks from Harry Potter. In those books, the cat is constantly trying to eat Ron's pet rat. It's acting like a cat and trying to eat a rat. It doesn't think, it doesn't speak like a human. So Crookshanks counts as person versus nature conflict. Ron is in conflict with the cat trying to eat its pet. However, an animal like Rocket in Guardians of the Galaxy is a full-on character in his own right. He thinks and acts too intelligently to count as just person versus nature conflict. Mythological animals can also sometimes count as conflict. In 10 Ways to Self-Sabotage, only a few of which relate to fairies by Sarah Polis, in Fae, which is an anthology of short stories reimagining the Fae, the fairies count as nature because they are treated like pests, like an infestation of cockroaches or crickets or something like that. They aren't thought of as characters or intelligent beings. So that's one way that mythological animals can also count as nature in a story. Similarly, you could have magic be a force of nature, almost like another element. If that's the case, when magic is just doing its thing, being magic, it's not being designed by somebody else to interfere with your characters, then it's really more of a person versus nature conflict, because that magic is a part of your magical world. So even mythological things can count as nature in person versus nature conflicts. The last one that can count as nature, but doesn't always, is illness. Whether physical or mental, your illness can be considered a part of nature if you think of the body as more a part of nature than a part of the self. So if your character is fighting cancer, it could be person versus nature conflict. Or an infection is almost always considered person versus nature, because that infection is nature. Now, if your philosophical leanings are more that the body is a part of the self, then it's considered a person versus self conflict, not person versus nature. Depends on your philosophies and how you approach it in your story. So, some things that count as nature and person versus nature conflicts are the weather. That's the big one that people use all of the time. The setting, animals as long as they're more like beasts, mythological animals and magic, again, as long as they're more a part of nature, the 4 elements, and illness. Lots of options here other than big natural disaster storms, even though those are still great and can be useful. Next, I want to share how to create meaningful person versus nature conflicts. Now that we have a better understanding of what is nature, let's talk about ways we can use that to impact our story. Having your characters sit on a park bench in the rain during a storm might on the surface look like a good person versus nature conflict, but if it's too easy to escape that conflict, it's not a very good one. It's not a meaningful one. If all my character has to do is get up off the bench and go inside, that's not a meaningful person versus nature conflict. If instead they're trapped, they're traveling between places, they can't find shelter, now that's a meaningful storm. Another way to think about if a conflict is meaningful or not is to ask yourself what the lasting effect it has. If all my character does is get wet and then they have to go and dry off, it's not a very lasting effect. But instead, if we think of something like a pandemic, unfortunately, which we are in now, that can be a very effective person versus nature conflict, which is what is the major conflict in Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. In that story, a virus, a pandemic, ravishes the world and completely changes it forever. Here is an excerpt of what the world looks like and how people's lives have been affected by this pandemic. 20 years after the end of air travel, the caravans of the traveling symphony moved slowly under a white-hot sky. It was the end of July, and the 25-year-old thermometer affixed to the back of the lead caravan read 106 degrees Fahrenheit, 41 degrees Celsius. Most of them were on foot to reduce the load on the horses, who had to be rested in the shade more frequently than anyone would have liked. The symphony didn't know this territory well and wanted to be done with it, but the speed wasn't possible in this heat. They walked slowly, with weapons in hand, the actors running their lines and the musicians trying to ignore the actors, scouts watching for danger ahead and behind on the road. What I like about these 2 paragraphs is they show you how this world has been completely changed by this pandemic. 1, there's no longer air travel. 2, there's no longer working motorized vehicles. We have to use horses now. 3, people are traveling around like they used to by foot in the old days, like bards used to perform and make a living. And then 3, most of these people probably wouldn't have chosen this lifestyle if the world was still in the state we know it today. So we can see all these different effects that the pandemic has had. In this story, the pandemic, the person versus nature conflict, affects every aspect of the story. It affects characters and their character growth. It affects the plot. Really, the plot wouldn't exist without that changed environment. And it affects the overall emotional tone of the story. This is an example where the major conflict in the story is person versus nature, and how it can be done effectively and meaningfully. Now, not every story is going to have that. In fact, most stories don't feature person versus nature as the major conflict. If you're writing a story like this, where person versus nature is a major conflict, ask yourself, what lasting impact does it have on the setting? How does it affect your characters over time? How is it moving your plot forward and creating the story arc? Make sure that your person versus nature conflict is leaving its mark on your story. Now, if that's not your story, if a major conflict isn't person versus nature, but it's more of a minor conflict in there, we still want to ask ourselves what the lasting effect is, but it's going to be smaller. For example, if I have a person versus nature conflict that's small, I can use that to directly lead to my next bigger conflict that my characters are going to face. For example, I can use a flash flood to flood a house or an office building or something and force two characters who maybe don't get along or need to work something out into the same space together. So they're bailing out this water, and now they have to confront whatever their issues are. Maybe they are having a fight, maybe they resent one another, maybe they're afraid to say what they're really feeling, but I can use that person versus nature conflict of a flash flood in a building to lead directly to that person versus person conflict and force them to face each other. So that's what I mean by a lasting effect that is smaller or that leads directly to another conflict. So person versus nature conflicts should have some sort of impact on your characters and your story. Next, I want to share an editor and author's tips for effectively using person versus nature conflicts. Authors are told to ask themselves what could be worse in their story all the time, as a way to add more conflict, to make sure things aren't too easy for your characters, and to keep the story moving. Sometimes our first thought or way to add more conflict is the cliche, make it rain, make the weather worse. While those conflicts can be effective, it can be a little bit cliche, and we want to be more unique than that. What I mean is, if you make things worse in your story by making it rain, I'm probably not going to remember that in a week as a reader, because how many other stories make it rain to make things worse for a character? Instead, draw an inspiration from real life to create more unique and meaningful conflicts that might be more memorable. For example, I recently read a Facebook post where someone was late to work because they had to figure out how to shoo a baby bat eating an Oreo out of their car. They couldn't leave until they got it out. That I would remember. So if you need your character to be late to work, you could make it rain. Or you could put a baby bat eating an Oreo in their car and have them have to deal with that. I'm definitely going to remember that second scene as a reader. Then they can be late to work. Their person versus nature conflict is going to lead to a conflict at work. Or if you do want to use that storm, make it rain, make it unique. In The Dragons of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, it rains what is almost acid. It's a deadly rain. That is unique and more interesting than just regular rain. If it hails and leads to an injury that's going to affect your character later on, that's a more unique, impactful way of using that storm. So think about how you can make a storm unique if you are going to use that, or what character growth, interpersonal conflicts it's going to lead to. So when you're using person versus nature conflicts, don't just throw them in there willy-nilly. Make sure they are having an impact and they are unique. What's your favorite person versus nature conflict to write? Share it in the comments below. And for more videos on conflicts and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. That is where you will find a guide to building strong settings, which will help you develop your settings to help you develop your nature conflicts. And if you want to see how I approach this in my writing, go to caitlinburvey.com. There you will find my book, When Magic Calls, a collection of modern fairy tales, other writings, books, and merchandise, so you can see how I do this. And now it's your turn to remember what counts as nature in Person versus Nature, and to make sure your person versus nature conflicts are having a lasting effect on your story. To ignite your ink.